Welcome, everybody. We're so pleased to see so many of you. We're at 134 attendees. You are attending the 2021 Anselm Lecture. My name is Emily Gary, and Rory Loughnane and I are the co-directors of the Center for Medieval and Early Modern Studies, or MEMS, at the University of Kent. Based in Canterbury and Paris, we're an interdisciplinary community of scholars, and we're about to celebrate our 25th birthday since our foundation back in 1996. We'll be hosting a virtual celebration of MEMS at 25 on Thursday, the 17th of June. And if you'd like to join us for this, stay tuned for more information, which we will circulate via our social media platforms. The very next day, that is Friday, the 18th of June, we will be celebrating our 7th annual MEMS Festival. This is an international conference organized entirely by our fantastic MA and PhD students. If your students are interested in submitting a paper or a session, please do so before the deadline for abstracts, which is the 30th of April. There'll be a link to the MEMS Fest website in the chat for all to share. The conference will be online and free to all delegates. As we in the UK begin to emerge from a long period on lockdown, I just wanted to take this special opportunity to thank the student founders and curators of MEMS Live, our student-run lockdown library of digital resources, which has been used by tens of thousands of visitors throughout this difficult year. So to Rasheen Astel, Anna Hegland, Daniela Gonzalez, Emma Louise Hill, Anna Nadine Pike, and to now Segalyn Gentz, George Knight, and Lucy Sparn, thank you for making hundreds of academic resources available to an international community throughout the pandemic. We're so proud of what you've achieved with MEMS Live. I just want to clarify a few Zoom things before I hand over to my wonderful colleague, David Rundle. First, in order to avoid interruptions, we're going to have all attendees on mute throughout the talk. We'll be sure to allow you to unmute to ask questions at the end, and there'll be plenty of time to do this. You can use the raise hand button to signal that you have a question, or you can use the chat box to ask your question, and the chairs will be sure to keep our eyes on the chat. So without further ado, I'm going to hand over to my excellent colleague, David, who will introduce our 2021 Anselm Lecture to be delivered by Professor Elaine Treharne. Over to you, David.
Emily, thank you very much, and it's a delight and an honour to be introducing this year's Anselm Lecture. This is, we believe, the 13th annual Anselm Lecture in the history of MEMS, and we have had an illustrious series of speakers in the past, and the sheen with which that comes is only now going to be increased yet further by having Elaine speaking with us today. It is also so fitting for us in MEMS to be celebrating the name of Anselm of Canterbury. Of course, Anselm of Aosta, or Anselm of Bec, somebody who was a traveling intellectual, an international intellectual, just like Elaine herself, who from her Welsh origins through her time in Manchester to Leicester and then across the ocean to Stanford. We're sorry that Elaine can't be with us in person this evening, but of course one of the delights of the delights of lockdown is the fact that we can have such an international audience and be able to host such an international event. Elaine, thank you very much for being with us. Now, I probably don't actually need to say anything to you about it, Elaine. I'm sure you all know, and indeed, looking at the list, I know that some people know Elaine very well and will be able to tell many stories. But Elaine is now the Roberta Bowman Denning Professor of Humanities at Stanford University. She is known to all of you for the wide range of her research and the dynamism with which she brings to manuscript studies, to digital humanities, to public engagement. And those are reflected in the range of the works recently published and forthcoming from Elaine's productive pen. There was recently edited with alongside Henrietta de Rold, who of course was one of our speakers this term and is in the audience today, the Cambridge Companion to British Medieval Manuscripts, in which MEMS has a small part in the fact that one of the chapters is by our colleague Ryan Perry. Elaine is also involved in a fascinating project coming out in the next couple of months, community translation of Beowulf, called Beowulf by All. And then to cap a busy year, in October, Oxford University Press will be publishing her monograph, Perceptions of Medieval Manuscripts, the Phenomenal Book, a work which, from her recent writings and lectures, I suspect will be a way for us to realize the many ways in which human beings and books interacted together through touch, through smell, sound, through seeing from a distance. We very much look forward to reading that work alongside all the others that Elaine has produced. But today, for her lecture, she is going to be talking to us about the practices of writing in England. Elaine, thank you very much for being with us and being our Anselm Lecturer for this year. Over to you.
Thank you, David. And thanks to Rory and Emily, David and Ryan for inviting me to do this lecture, which I've kind of been anxious about for weeks as these things generally kind of go, and doing a lot, which I hope is reflected in the lecture, but also kind of writing until the very last minute. So I'm hopeful that this will go well, and should be, I think, about sort of 55 minutes if I stop wittering. I would also just like to say, in relation to sort of social media, please follow the MEMS account on Twitter. It's absolutely wonderful, and I think demonstrates a vibrant and friendly and welcoming set of colleagues. I'm so thrilled and interested in what everybody's doing at the University of Kent, and it's becoming such a leader in the field for medieval studies in particular, and I'm sure early modern too. So without further ado, I'm going to share my screen with you. I have many slides oops, didn't mean to do that, as a distraction. This is from Lambeth 107, a beautiful image that I discuss in the Perceptions of Medieval Manuscripts. But what I'm about to present to you is entirely new work, using a poem that I've worked on for many years as a springboard for thinking about practices of writing. And obviously my title is ridiculously overambitious to try and cover 200 years. But I really am going to try, and I totally blame St. Anselm, because it was rereading Eadmer's life that kind of inspired this topic. So sometime in the late 12th century, a scribe whom few would consider calligraphically accomplished added a poem to an extensive bilingual homiliary. And I gave a lecture last year with David Rundle and the Institute for Historical Research in London on paleography. And I ended by talking about other aspects of this manuscript. And so I'm taking this now as the start for my new research, and thinking about this manuscript and this poem. So a scribe, as you can see on the bottom right of that image, as I say, who is not among the most calligraphically expert, added this poem. And at the time of this writing, this English lyric filled the half-empty recto of the folio, and in so doing, for this scribe, completed the manuscript. For the scribe, it was important to round off the page, to offer final thoughts on this book and this world indeed, and thus to have the last word, reminding readers how horrific is the fate of the physical decomposition that awaits us all. Ladlich is that eorthus, and grim in it wunion, fair thu shealt wunion, and wormers they to delith, thus tu bist delayed, and ladist in a fronden. Nefs tu nen a freon, they will a faran tu, that efra will a locian who they, that hus they licia. That efra undon, they will a thadura and they after a lichten. For sona du bist ladlich, and lad to a seana. So shortly after this poem had been written out, a scribe who appears elsewhere in the manuscript added Latin texts to the verso of this folio early in the 13th century then, and also on an added bifolium comprising folios 171 and 172. And these Latin editions include an excerpt from Alan of Lille's Expositio Prosae de Angelis, an early instance of the genre of sequence commentary that suggests the codex, comprised principally of homilies to this point, was now becoming a contemporary reference volume for liturgical exposition. Because of the entry of this Latin text on folio 170 verso, there was only the most marginal space for expansion then, when another scribe decided to really finish off the grave with 1.5 lines of touching observation. You can see those right at the bottom of the screen. Forsone bythyn habet faxes berevid, al bythyn feias ferne forwarden, nale hypnan mit fingers fere strakien. So reminding us that not only in the grave will we be hateful to see, but soon your head will lose its hair, the hair's fairness will perish, and no one with their fingers will gently stroke it. What I want to do in researching this verse addition to Bodley 343, the whole poem, The Grave, is determine its possible date and mode of composition. And this would allow me to think further about the role of the vernacular in the last decades of the 12th century, when texts in English are relatively rare. Beyond what the poem means, its alliterative scheme, personification of death, about the role of the, about claustrophobia, of the permanent consciousness of having died. Beyond this, who might have written this poem, and what was the context in which it was created? How does it relate to the physical book through which it is made permanent? And these questions matter for all kinds of reasons, as I'll suggest. They may be of most significance for literary scholars, especially those who recognize the continuity of a dynamic English tradition from pre-conquest into the High Middle Ages. But there's a fascinating domino effect of raising these questions about the spaces of textual production upon communities of writing and institutional practices, and particularly in this period of the very long 12th century, which is so often seen as falling between or a movement towards. So what I'm going to do this morning, evening, is to ask when, where, who, and now what of these marginal additions to Bodley 343. I want to discuss actual writing practices and scholarly understanding of writing practices. And this is new and still joyful work for me, a first outing for some of this research, and I'm eager to hear your thoughts on places, people, and the technologies of writing in the long and lingering 12th century. So staying with Bodley 343 for a while then, the script of the main part of the grave is roughly co-temporal with the two main scribes of the extensive manuscript. And of course, they write in Latin and English. So there's examples of these hands on the left and on the right of the screen. So this would be datable to around 1170 to perhaps something like 1190. That's for all of the writing that you can see, including the first part of the Old English poem, The Grave. Now, these lines of the poem fill the space precisely as you can see on the right. They round off, as I said, the recto, and they ensure the retention of a visual cogency to the manuscript, not taking the poem over to the verso. And this is typical, as Aidan Conti, in his fundamental research on this manuscript, has shown is also the case for the original design of the manuscript, so not including this folio 170 recto on the right-hand side. So this rounding off is also a feature more generally that typifies manuscript production in sort of the post-1140 period, a desire to round off lines that we see so frequently in psalters, for example, in the 13th century and 14th century, to close up white space within the writing grid. And one of the digital projects that I'm involved with, Stanford Global Currents, has automated the process of extracting white space as a feature from manuscripts. And that's something that we're currently finishing up our findings on. So anyway, some decades after this scribal effort, another scribe, as we've seen, happy to be writing in English, finished the grave with words that touch on the hope of resurrection, despite the morbid focus of the preceding theme. So this is the last kind of 3 verses in that sort of slightly shaky hand. They dramatically alter the tone of the poem for those with theological awareness, creating a sense of hope and resurrection out of what seems a dark and endless entombed misery. This hand of these final verses can be dated to the earlier 13th century, perhaps as much as a couple of decades after the writing of the first version of the grave. So was the addition effectively completing an already existing and known poem? Was it created afresh for this space? There's no doubt that the grave existed in an exemplar, evidence for which is provided by the erasures of ditographic errors on the part of the scribe, and they're beautifully ringed on the screen there. He repeats Hus in line 1, 2, 3, 4, and repeats death has the key at the end of line 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. So perhaps this writer returned to the manuscript to finish the poem off, knowing that the space existed and determined to squeeze the final poignant lines in. So this is, in other words, was it a pre-existing poem beyond the exemplar? But also, one could ask, was this a personal and meaningful intervention of an aging and mournful poet? Well, I hardly think so, given that this is the same scribe who fills other spaces in the manuscript with contemporary and actually innovative hymns to the Virgin Mary. So I've given you snippets of the script of this scribe from 3 different places in the manuscript for comparison, and the bottom of the snippets on the right is from the last lines of the grave. Key elements of the letter forms allow for the identification of this single trembling scribe. In particular, the upward rising top stroke of tall S with its distinctive hook, as you can see from the 3 snippets of stints on the right. Now, the music on the left and also elsewhere in the manuscript is comprised of a 4-line stave and fully diastematic notation with C and F clef. And thank you to Benjamin Albritton at Stanford University Libraries for talking about medieval music with me. And it's particularly early given the date of the earliest part of the 13th century. And it makes these musical additions very significant indeed. And they confirm the use of the volume for those researching and contemplating liturgical formulations. The function of the codex then transforms from its homiletic origins as a preaching book, as Aidan Conti has suggested, in contrast to Susan Irvin's categorization of the manuscript as devotional. And they convert it then from a preaching book to an anthology of reference materials, effectively. More though, this scribe's additions, and here's another one, refocus the manuscript towards not just the liturgical and the performative, but also to the Marian. And that's very timely given the explosion of the cult of the Virgin Mary in the, as the 12th century progressed into the High Middle Ages. So I will also tell you, genuine interest in whether or not this manuscript might prove to be in the scribal hand of a woman at this point in its history. Manuscripts, 12th century manuscripts in English, and I'm thinking of Cotton Vespasian D14 and Cambridge Corpus Christi College 383, were transferred from whatever institutions they originated in into the hands of women by the end of the 12th century. So underlying a good deal of my new research going forward is the hunt for women scribes. And it's certainly one of the principal questions that emerges in relation to this hand, doing these additions to Bodley 343. So this detail inspires a number of questions, chief among them, can we say when, where, and by whom this poem and this music was written? And more, what can this short work compel one to ask about writing practices and communities of writing in this period? And so we're still on the question of when. I'd like to start with who and when the grave might have been written, and for now focus on the effort on the last 3 verses in the line and a half at the bottom of folio 170 recto. So we're still hovering around these lines. These lines, as we've seen, have attracted tremendous attention, partly by poets, Borges included, by other scholars, but particularly tremendous attention because they exhibit, like the tremulous hand of Worcester, a tremor. Now, the tremulous hand, for those who don't know, is a religious figure working somewhere in the West Midlands and usually placed in Worcester, who wrote English poetry and annotated, punctuated and modernized many Old English manuscripts linked with Worcester in the period that we're precisely discussing here. In 2006, Christine Franzen disputed the possibility that the verse, the music, and the note about the age of the Virgin Mary in Bodley 343 were by the famous Tremulous Hand. Now, I'm not sure the rejection of the identification is right, but Franzen knows the hand better than anyone. And if these notes were by the Tremulous Hand or by a contemporary in Bodley 343, what would contemporaneity mean? Okay, so what contemporaneousness can we detect between the last lines of the grave and the other additions by that scribe and the Tremulous Hand themselves? So what of the Tremulous Hand then? What if the Tremulous Hand were responsible for these additions? The scribe certainly shows vibrant interest in and skill at composition of English in the many engagements and interventions made in manuscripts. Tremulous Hand was certainly active around 1200, but it's been suggested by Neil Carr and concurred with by Christine Franzen that the activity of this scribe and the effort could actually be as late as 1250. In his very brief article in the book Books, Collectors and Libraries, a collection of Carr's essays, Carr suggested that there can be no doubt that the Tremulous Hand was working at a much later date than the late 12th century, where tremulous is often assigned. And Carr based this reading on one set of marginal notes in Oxford Bodleian Library manuscript Hatton 114, a Worcester manuscript dated to the second half of the 11th century and associated with St. Wulfstan himself. Here on the slide, you can see the marginal table of contents in the upper right-hand column, upon which Carr's 1.5-page article focuses, drawing attention to the relationship of the tremulous correction, which you can see towards the bottom third of that column, tremulous's corrections to the table of contents. Drawing attention to these, Carr stated that the Gothic hand belongs probably to the second quarter of the 13th century. It can hardly be earlier than 1225 and may not be much, if at all, earlier than 1250. In a footnote, Carr thanks another paleographer historian, Noel Denholm Young, for permitting him to quote his opinion that the hand is the middle of the 13th century. And this is a fascinating kind of demonstration of specialist research, how a probably can become a no doubt without evidence being put forward, although of course there's no question of Carr's unsurpassed expertise. This probably is shored up by another scholar's unsubstantiated opinion, again, an opinion that issues from experience and skill, but still. So the main features I surmise, because you have to surmise the main features by which these dating statements are made, the main features that would have led to the dating of the table of contents upon which so much seems to hang, as middle of the 13th century, or at least second quarter of the 13th century, are, I surmise, the shaft of T protruding above the cross stroke and the closed upper bowl of A, and I've ringed some examples of those. In Denholm Young's Handwriting in England and Wales, his summary of dating features at the back of the book refer to the closing of the head of A, not though as being middle of the 13th century, but as being circa 1275, and the innovation of the form of T with a pierced cross stroke, Denholm Young suggests is actually around 1330 to 1350. So there's an inconsistency then in what we can deduce from the statements and evidence that we have to gather from other spaces and places in order to support those statements that are being made. And there's a lot to pin the career. This is a lot to pin the career of the Tremulous Hand on, or rather, it's a little. And my research, I think, is beginning to show, I want to say unequivocally, but don't ever say that in paleography, but I want to show that the features can be found earlier, that these features that I surmise provide the date can be found earlier. Moreover, I think we need to note that the script type and grade are significant here. The more formal and set the hand, the less graphically flexible. The table of contents shows some degree of formality and is perhaps the hand of a professional scribe in training. But let's think about this in the broader context of known, dated and datable manuscripts. And in Pamela Robinson's 2 volumes of datable manuscripts in London libraries, examples of earlier 13th century manuscripts show the cross-stroke of T being pierced by the shaft and an almost complete closure of the bowl of A. But contemporary examples that are less formal, more cursive, like Sloane, oh, hang on. So, okay, so these are the ones that are relatively formal. Less formal ones, like Sloane 1580 and Tiberius B13. So let me just give you a chance to look at those as I talk. Are more advanced. So these are less formal, right? They're more advanced in the inclusion of these dated and datable features. Just show you that one. So manuscripts with parallel features to those in the Hatton 114 table of contents example are by no means exclusive to a post-1225 date of production. And for arguably even greater relevance, thanks to the magic of digitization, on which more later, London British Library additional manuscript 89137, which is the descriptive rental of Worcester Cathedral Priory, includes at folio 80 recto a text dated to 1253. Oh, look at those dots. I don't know why those circles are there. Oh, yes, I do. Haha, right. So here, now this is dated to 1253, and here there is considerable greater modernity of the script, for want of a better phrase, right? So that this can be usefully compared with the Hatton 114 table of contents. And to my eye, the table of contents firmly predates this localizable Worcester hand. And this all sums up to say that the tremulous hand is earlier than Carr proposes. And by comparison, for contemporaneity, the Bodley 343 scribe is almost certainly a contemporary and operating around the beginning of the 13th century. So then the question is, but where? So why is Bodley 343 connected, or often said to be connected, with Worcester by scholars, and what does that matter? Bodley 343 seems to be loosely assigned to a Worcester-ish localization because it contains English, and it's well known that English was long reverenced at that institution. But this knowledge has had the effect of foreclosing various other possibilities. If the scribe we've been discussing, who wrote The End of the Grave and the Marian hymns, is not the tremulous hand, then what is the Worcester connection? More to the point, as others have commented, if it were a Worcester manuscript and the original compilation is circa 1170 or 1180, then where is the tremulous hand? One might expect to see tremulous intervening in an English manuscript that was kept at that cathedral. And Franzen does briefly talk about this manuscript too. So what other evidence might one adduce for a Worcester-ish localization? Well, there is a Wulfstan connection in the manuscript, very loose Wulfstan connection in the manuscript, in as much as this strange image of a Bishop Wulfstan appears as an addition to a blank folio in Bodley 343. This has been tenuously dated to the 13th century, but clearly seems to me to be much later, with its use of a distinctive emulative, perhaps early modern English vernacular minuscule. Wulfstan I was Bishop of Worcester and Archbishop of York, and Wulfstan II was Bishop of Worcester in the 11th century. And Wulfstan I's most familiar connection, though, so I'm going to suggest something different now, is neither with York, where he was Archbishop, and nor with Worcester, but was in fact with Ely Cathedral, where he is both buried and commemorated in an Ely book, the 12th century Liber Eliensis. So it's interesting to find, in respect of yet another marginal addition to Bodley 343, more evidence for other reflections on the manuscript. And there is also, for example, a connection, and these are all additions, right? They're all in the margins or on blank space, previously blank spaces. But there is, for example, a connection also with Saint Wulfhad, an obscure pre-conquest English saint, whose cult is most closely associated with Stone in Staffordshire, which was a house itself linked with Kenilworth. At folio 3 recto of Bodley 343, someone called Guilelmo Rettori, who charged 2 shillings for his work, and you can see that on the bottom left there, per travail, 2 shillings, wrote this laudatory hymn praising Wulfhad as a new Isaac, a true martyr of God. I'll spare you the reading in Latin, but the last line, nos tuere Marte vere Dei preciose, brings out the kind of honour that is being provided to Wulfhad at this point in the manuscript in this 13th century edition. So is this poem any kind of evidence for anything other than a possible West Midlands? So you've got Stone in Staffordshire or Kenilworth, or the kind of Worcester-ish connection. Is it evidence for anything else than a possible West Midlands or Staffordshire affiliation or connection for Bodley 343? Well, Wulfhad was, as some of you may know, the murdered brother of St. Werburgh, who's patron saint now of Chester Cathedral, and has been associated with that city since the later Middle Ages. Both of these saints, Werburgh and Wulfhad, had something of a resurgence in the 12th century, along with other pre-conquest saints appropriated by Norman prelates. And with Wulfhad, a life was created for him in the 12th century. But as Alan Thacker has recently written about in detail, Werburgh's cult was actually most prominent not at Chester in this period, but at Ely, where she was venerated along with all of the other female saints associated with the foundation of that cathedral abbey. So Lives of Werburgh were written into a number of manuscripts written at Ely in the 12th century, including the Liber Eliensis manuscript, Cambridge Trinity College 021, London British Library, Cotton Manuscript Caligula A8, and Cambridge Corpus Christi College manuscript 393. Because we can access all three of these manuscripts digitally, it's possible to look at commonalities of all kinds. So, for example, in the Liber Eliensis, it's just interesting to note that there is music in the margins of the codex devoted to the Virgin Mary, added to that book, which is later than the music that I showed you in Bodley 343, but suggests a kind of similar emphasis in the transformation of the book from one thing to another. And in the case of the Liber Eliensis, from this mass of documents about Ely to this kind of more performative volume. And this, again, comes as no surprise in relation to Marian worship, which became so predominant in the course of the 12th century. But both Ely and Worcester cathedrals had Mary as their titular saint. Even so, I think, all of these things sort of add up to suggest that the case for localization of Bodley 343 is worth reopening. So another point of connection that moves Bodley 343 away from Worcester and towards somewhere else are the rather odd decorated initials in the manuscript. Now, this is less about the plain inked enlarged initials and much more about the littera notabiliores in the book. In Bodley 343, unusual capitals, which are black and red with geometric or foliate designs, and also, you can see the example of the green eye there, may be linked with an earlier English manuscript that is assigned first to Christchurch, Canterbury, but then to Ely. It moved from Christchurch to Ely, and that is Cambridge University Library II 133, which Orietta Derald and I and Mary Swan have written on a number of times. So I just draw your attention to that bird, beaky A in CUL II 133, and the really strange initials in Bodley 343. And again, it kind of, this Ely just kind of keeps cropping up. It's interesting, especially in the light of Wulfhad, as I've suggested. And there are also textual analogies between this manuscript, University Library II 133, and the eschatological texts in Bodley 343, which suggest again that this is a connection worth pursuing. And it ought not to be a surprise in a sense, despite the geographical distance, for these Benedictine monastic institutions to be connected, both through English vernacular textual production and their paleographical elements. But let me finally, on where, draw your attention to the strange and wonderful decorative devices in Bodley 343. And I think that the artist was trying, I want to just draw, so with my cursor, I'm just waving around here, these very strange kind of initials that look, the finials on these initials with this sticky out pointy bit, which is really notable in various kind of decorative devices through the manuscript. And it's distinctive. And I think what the scribe was trying, the artist was trying to do was perhaps to do something like the decorative finials on these much more commonly seen initials, like we see here. But the closest I found to what the scribe in what the artist in body 343 is doing is in this Oxford manuscript, the Dialogues of St. Gregory by Angers. Work on this work on this scribe and the kind of St. Fridswitz in Oxford in general is being done by Andrew Dunning, and he's very generously made his work available through a website, and I really strongly recommend it to all of you. It's absolutely superb work. But that's the closest parallel I found after rooting around for forever, is this also raised finger profile of the manuscript artist here. So what this does certainly suggest, and what the differing initials in body 343 do provide, is a reminder, so back to this other initial, a reminder of the variety of this kind of work in the later 12th and into the 13th century. And in fact, on the right-hand side here is a Tewkesbury manuscript, which just strikes me also as having interesting connections with the much more common initials in body 343. But we need to remember about the fact that teams produced books, and that monastic institutions from the second half of the 12th century increasingly hired scribes and artists to come and assist in the manufacture of books. And that this variety that we see in this sequence, both of initials, but also in terms of the additions to the texts, appears to be of the moment at this point in the history of textual production. So precisely when the efforts of paleographers are headed towards the pinning down of script through the categorization and delineation and labeling of different types of scripts as Gothic emerged with all of its variant forms, at precisely that moment is the moment when we most see variety. And I draw your attention here then to the work of Matthew Aiello at the University of Pennsylvania, whose recent substantial article on the form of English vernacular script in the 13th century demonstrates that for writers of English, variety is a condition of the writing environments of the day. And these scribes parche the most deluxe volumes with the highest grade of Gothic textura seemed often to just get on with the task at hand. So Matthew Aiello talks about the characteristics of and relationships between scripts which need to be considered fully if we're to gain a more accurate understanding of the relative places of ones used to write English in the 13th century. And that what the evidence collected reveals more than anything is that 13th century scripts are often scripts whose very condition is variety. And in this article, this substantial research piece, Aiello is focused on English. But actually these comments are equally valid for Latin textual manufacture and French, of course. And Gothic textualis or textura, bookhand, does not dominate book production, not even close, but it does tend to dominate discussions of paleography in sort of the post-1180 period. And it's not in textura that scholars find innovation and change in the development of script. That is found in the less formal hands, even those that share space with the finest textualists. Now, Eric Weisscott at Boston College, in his most recent book, Meter and Modernity in English Verse, 1350 to 1650, questions the utility of periodization as a mode of analysis of change. And 15 years ago, in arguing for the vitality of English in the 12th century, I asked similar questions of the oppression of scholarly divides created by labels that emerge not just from periodization, but also from categories like old and middle in English. And more recently, Ardis Butterfield has asked us to think about the languages in the Middle Ages, English, Latin, and French in England, in particular with Old Norse, at this time as belonging on a spectrum of linguistic possibility and ability. We might think about script then in a similarly connective and non-hierarchized way, because as Laura Ashwood put it, while change does happen over time, it doesn't map onto modern delimiters of history, modern delimitation, is that a word? Of history, or indeed of discipline, or indeed of language. So this spectrum of flexibility certainly might reflect a reality that would have been more recognizable perhaps to participants in cultures of writing in the period up to circa 1250. Who are the people accessing, using, transforming, creating, and inspiring book production with all of its associated and orbiting environments of textual production? When Sebastian Sebecki gave his superb Chaucer lecture here at the University of Kent a few weeks ago, he was able to narrow down communities of vernacular writing practice in London after 1400 by focusing on the personnel involved in the facture of literary and documentary texts. Now, we do also have some evidence for who did what writing when and where for the earliest medieval period, but in much less density and with far fewer names. Of those names of writers we know, much can be revealed about the ubiquity of textual production, obviously in monastic and ecclesiastical circles, but also by analogy, potentially elsewhere. And here again, it is useful to think of variety, nimbleness, and pragmatic responses to need in terms of writing practices, and in so doing, to think in different ways for communities that engaged in these activities. Would removing some of the focus on scriptoria, which is, other than in inverted commas, not a term I use anymore, would removing some of the focus on scriptoria permit one to think more broadly in terms of writing practices, and think instead of central figures, of book owners and keepers, not in place of institutional ownership, but as well as. Indeed, what does it mean to own a book in this pre-1200 period? In his handwriting in English books, in the Cambridge History of the Book, Malcolm Parkes reminded readers of the reality of book production in the 12th century. Organised copying, he said, by members of the community usually lasted only for short periods. Once a community had built up this collection of texts, organised copying was abandoned, and with some of the distinctive features in local handwriting. Now, Parkes is undoubtedly right when it comes to, say, the 11th century. And some years ago, in relation to Leofric, Bishop of Exeter, and his circle of scribes, I followed up on a comment of TAM bishops that Leofric had effectively his own episcopal library, right? He created this library, or had it created, when he moved his bishopric from Crediton to Exeter in 1050. Countering comments by earlier scholars that Leofric had the canons of Exeter write the books he required, I postulated that his writing office was temporary, exigent, and concerted, established only to produce what the bishop needed to go about his work. 8 scribes seem principally to be working on manuscripts for Leofric, simultaneously with a developed house style and in a relatively short period of time. These books made by this cohort of professionals are among those gathered by Leofric, some of which, as is well known, were then donated to Exeter Cathedral Chapter on his death in 1072. Now, I've argued that it's unlikely to be Exeter canons who predominated in this writing office, and rather they may have been colleagues that Leofric, as former Chancellor for Edward the Confessor, drafted in from the proto-chancery. Perhaps there's something similar happening at this time in other episcopal residences throughout 11th century England, extending, one might imagine, into the 12th century, sometimes in concert with dedicated and deliberate scribal effort on behalf of an institution that may have ebbed and flowed with demand. Perhaps, too, that demand can be seen to coincide with new prelates coming into their offices. Now, this transient and nimble cohort of learned professionals is certainly what can be understood by Thomas Becket and his entourage 100 years later. Not only had Thomas Becket been Chancellor for Henry II, gathering expertise and professional clerical personnel around him, some of whom were themselves translated into positions of preeminence in the English Church, but also he had a level of proficiency himself. In his years in exile, his biographers reveal, and especially those years at Pontigny in 1164 to 1166, he surrounded himself with learned men who formed a bookish circle of companions, as Laura Cleaver and Anne Duggan have both elucidated so well in the recent collection devoted to Herbert of Boston. The Archbishop himself, Thomas Becket, copied books, received manuscripts and texts produced at his request, and, as Herbert of Boston reported, Becket used his time in exile to focus intently, intellectually and spiritually, on the epistles and psalms. The writing activities among this group was evidently pressured and intensive, given the number of letters that were created in addition to the books. While being in exile was presumably akin to the focus provided by a scholar's sabbatical in universities in the good old days before committees and audits ate into time. But a detailed picture emerges in the writings of Becket's biographers and entourage of the varied business of a writing community. Some of the fruits of this community's work are made evident in the accounts of Becket's murder in 1170, as William Fitzstephen, a contemporary and present Becket biographer, narrates about the vandalism and theft undertaken by the assailants after they'd murdered Becket in the cathedral. The assailants broke open his chests and bookcases. They seized gold and silver vessels, money, gold signet rings, papal bulls, books, precious materials. They entered the rooms of the clerics and carried off their garments, books, money, baggage, together with all their household furnishings. That books are part of the personal belongings of an archbishop and his clerical circle would come as no surprise, perhaps. But the ubiquity of the book in these circles says more again about the writing and book owning practices in this period. Perhaps one of the most famous instances of this book producing bishop, along with Wulfstan I and Leofric from pre-conquest England, is St. Anselm himself, who I hope doesn't feel too let down by this lecture in his name. In his Life of St. Anselm of Canterbury, Eadmer's chapter 19 deals with the books Anselm wrote and what first happened to the one which is called the Proslogion. In this account, Eadmer details Anselm's intellectual and spiritual struggles with the genesis of his great account of God's existence in the Proslogion. And we are told that suddenly one night during Matins, the grace of God illuminated his heart. And so he wrote parts of the Proslogion, or the beginnings of the Proslogion, on writing tablets and gave them to one of the brethren of the monastery for safekeeping. But those were lost. So, as on the slide here, Anselm wrote another draft on the same subject on other tablets and handed them over to the same monk for more careful keeping. Now, he placed them once more by his bed in a more secret place, and the next day, having no suspicion of any mischance, he found them scattered on the floor beside his bed and the wax which was on them strewn about in small pieces. After the tablets had been picked up and the wax collected together, they were taken to Anselm. He pieced together the wax and recovered the writing, though with difficulty. Fearing now that some might be lost through carelessness, he ordered it, the Proslogion, in the name of the Lord, to be copied onto parchment. The operation of writing practices here is revealing. So first, a senior prelate is inspired to write a book himself. That's not surprising, but he does so as the inspiration strikes, utilizing writing materials that are close by. In this case, the impermanent and fragile drafting tools and substrate, the wax tablets, proved easily lost not once, but twice. When the writing is to be made expeditiously but permanently, the task is assigned to a scribe and written on parchment. Yet we know too that Anselm did more than write drafts himself. Earlier, in chapter 15 of the same life by Eadmer, Eadmer narrates that when a monk was possessed by a demon, a fellow monk, and I quote, went in haste to Anselm, who was busy in the cloister correcting books. Reculfus, the monk, ad Anselmum qui tunc in claustro emendandis libris. Numerous other prelates and learned scholars are known to have corrected books too, whether their own or other writers. Pre-conquest correctors included Ælfric and Wulfstan in the 11th century, Leofric, to whom I've already referred, Coleman, the later 11th century Worcester monk and St. Wulfstan's chancellor. Then of the many, we can note the 13th century prelate, St. Edmund of Abingdon, of whom we are told, and I quote, the blessed Edmund used to detest idleness and sloth, and was himself always occupied either in praying or in meditating, or in the correcting of books, or in hearing confessions, or in solving questions put to him by his brethren. Most manuscripts show signs of having been corrected indeed, and sometimes this work is done by the scribe and or author themselves. And I want to bear in mind the tremulous scribe and the scribe working through Bodley 343. And I want us to move away from thinking of scribes writing in English as the kind of dimwits of their institutions, and instead to recognize that this work is going on at this level of seniority in the church. In the case of Herbert of Boston, Laura Cleaver and Stella Panayotova note that Herbert corrected and annotated the volumes of his own work on Peter Lombard's Glossa Magnatura in perhaps the 1170s. And this manuscript is digitized on the wonderful Cambridge Trinity College website. And I cannot imagine a better way to spend a few hours. I encourage you than to sit and just go through it. It is just glorious. In Cambridge Corpus Christi College 303 too, circa 1150, of Rochester manuscript of homilies and saints' lives. The manuscript's corrector is also the rubricator, miniator and third scribe, Scribe C, who in his catalogue of manuscripts containing Anglo-Saxon, Neil Carr called the less good hand. But it is this less good hand that oversees the book's compilation and composition, and who illustrates in his stints the most up-to-date and independent writing forms. Now, I dealt with the problem of value judgments like those of Carr's less good hand that are seen throughout the field of paleography. I dealt with these in my essay, The Good, the Bad and the Ugly, some years ago. But such value judgments continue to affect how we interpret and evaluate scribal performance in the overall system of writing practices. And I take you back again to the scribe in Bodley 343. In terms of manuscripts, one might argue that the inclination to define scribal performance by calligraphic and aesthetic values without explicitly stating those criteria has detrimentally affected how scholars regard not just the hands of individual actors, but all those who are neither clearly diplomatically engaged in the copying of administratively originating documentation, nor attempting to emulate formal bookhand, either Caroline minuscule or Gothic. Other scribal performances, and necessarily all non-Latin scribal performances, are thus judged by lack, by absence of attributes of formality and high grade. And this is in error, really. Some of the least visually appealing handwriting belongs to the most brilliant scholars, to a Wulfstan or a St. Hugh of Lincoln, for example, or obviously to the Tremulous Hand of Worcester and other slightly shaky exponents of contemporary poetic and musical art. It is thus perhaps most often in the work of the correctors, the annotators, the glossators, the commentators, and the folio fillers that the innovation and fresh movement both begins and rubs along happily with the more obviously enviable expert exponents of textura. As usual, all the exciting stuff is happening in the margins. Let's look at Herbert of Boston again. This is a random screen grab, but it's possible to see at the most cursory of glances how the commentary and the layers of notes provide diagnostic information for scripts that are yet to emerge in a widespread fashion. Such an observation is important not simply for the reassessment of the means by which scholars audit and assess manuscript production, but also because it insists that scholars think again about writing practices and the skills required to write. So many scribes are described as poor or untrained, when if they wrote at all, they simply could not have been untrained. Henrietta de Rolde's fundamental questions in her working with paper about what constitutes scribal training and what we mean by professional scribes is essential for beginning to unpick the hierarchizing effect of categories of book production that begin at the top with textura and move down a list of aesthetically and secretly impelled classification. Now, I think it may have been Malcolm Parkes in his English Cursive Bookhands, published in 1960, who first made the observation that the majority of scribes writing utilitarian volumes, and I quote, took as their model the handwriting used about 1200 for writing commentaries. But he sees between 1200 and 1300 the development of new hierarchies of script, all based on varieties of cursive. It's a more bottom-up view, Parkes's, of the paleographical world, but one that, again, that will need reassessment as more textual materials are made available for scrutiny through digitization. This careful set of experiences with manuscripts and documents might, as with all paleographical scholarship to this point, require refining in the light of the richness and abundance of the digital environment in which so many study and to which all have access. So that reappraisal might begin by acknowledging the ideological position from which each of us works and the mode in which we are trained. And training, of course, is key. Even as specialist posts are eliminated at universities like Leicester, the demand for training expands. The varieties of script that had emerged by 1200 and that accelerated as professional writers proliferated in the 13th century change, or should change perhaps, how present-day scholars regard practices of writing. Access to the digital will inevitably prove established narratives to be in need of modification. Our work, our scholarship, becomes more provisional, not less. And what of the role of paleography? It is desperately required in university curricula, and especially so with the recognition of the significance of comparative work across traditions of textual production globally. In my Stanford Text Technologies digital project, Global Currents, and another one, so this is Global Currents, and another one, Cybertext Technologies, with teams of scholars, Benjamin Albriton, Mateusz Fafiński, Mohamed Shariat in particular. We have been deliberately cognizant of the potential for research that privileges equally forms of human communication that extend from Peru to Dunhuang to Blombos to Bangor. Our newest project aims to investigate other forms of scribal connection that are manifested intriguingly by profound variation. These are mortuary rolls, these entries of the entries of male and female houses who contributed to messages of condolence and prayer on the death of religious colleagues, as here on the screen with Lucy de Vere, Prioress of Castle Hedingham. Building on Jean Dufour's foundational editorial work, Mateusz Fafiński and I, with a team of 4 researchers, are building a deep interactive map and network model of all the institutions, persons, places, and scripts evinced in this role. And despite the diversity of hands visible on the screen, but there's hundreds of them, right, in this and other roles, they were all compiled within a relatively short space of time. We should learn an immense amount from their detailed digital analysis. And so this is Medieval Networks of Memory we've just started. Now, the variety in this mortuary role is exemplary of the diversity of hands and scripts in this period. That diversity led to Hilary Jenkinson to write Paleography and the Practical Study of Court Hand. I'll just show you the book in 1915. In it, Jenkinson published 13 plates with descriptions and evaluations, and these plates demonstrate how difficult scribal outcomes were. In a section at the back of the book, Jenkinson reveals the trick of the book, that all 13 plates, revealing tremendous variation, were written in the very same year, despite the extreme differentiation of hand. His motivation is, as he says, to show, and I quote, that the importance of paleographical science is overrated. And I quote again, that a great deal of time is given unnecessarily to paleography. His answer is to prioritize the history of administration, from which knowledge of dates and formulae can be better derived than through paleographical study. Doubts about the role of paleography, because of its subjectivity, have been raised by other scholars. But emphatic doubts have also been raised about the role of the digital environment in making progress in manuscript studies. In David Gantz's obituary for Malcolm Parkes, which is available online, he stated, and I quote, "Parkes's work is a reminder that in the age of digital paleography and its supposedly scientific advances, there is no substitute for constant contact with manuscripts and for an ability to do more than describe them. Tables of page sizes may enable us to distinguish books from different centres, but we are entitled to ask why a particular scribe or patron chose a particular format to copy a particular text. Sadly, books are for reading, not just for looking at the scripts or the pictures." But a global pandemic, and for somebody in California, is a reminder that without digital paleography, very few of us would have been able to make any advances at all in our work with manuscripts. All gratitude to librarians and digitizers. And in one sense, the digital environment is the great equalizer. Now, to capitalize and exploit this richness of resource, training is more important than ever in paleography and other forms of interpretative methods that explain modes of textual production. Is this a field that is prepared to question itself? Can the field willingly engage in new methods now that so much more material is available worldwide for the first time for sustained scrutiny? Is it a field prepared to make itself accessible and open to upcoming and established scholars who work on languages and traditions other than Latin, or whose credentials vary while their encouragement should not? Among the possibilities that digitization permits is the opportunity to create a more nuanced account of developments in manuscripts and record production in this period, and to query what have been long established foundational narratives. This requires an open-mindedness and an acceptance that former accounts will require modification, that remarks which were made speculatively with probablys and no doubts were meant as such. It must become acceptable to revise opinions of those who've come before us, to analyse the script of those we normally dismiss, who are literally marginal, and continue thereby to generate the landscape of textual production in the Middle Ages. Thank you.